So Dan, thanks again for joining us. Great to hear from you today and your role. Just so you're the chairman of the Libertarian Party and the Midlands Regional Coordinator. Can you tell us a little bit about these roles and what you do in the party?
Of course. So the primary role of the party chairman is to chair what we call the NCC, which is the National Coordinating Committee. A lot of people call them the NEC in other parties, which is the National Executive Committee, but we are a different kind of party. So we don't have an executive at the national level because we are a devolved party, and we believe, as is, I would say, common to libertarian thought generally, that the power resides in the individual members. And so the power flows up from the grassroots. And so we have a coordinating committee at the national level. I'm the chairman of it. And it's basically made up of the party officers, the leader, the nominating officer, treasurer. The committee has the regional coordinators on it and national secretaries for membership, press, young libertarians, that kind of thing. So I chair that committee, and our job is to ensure the party acts within, first of all, electoral law and also the boundaries of its own constitution. So, my job is to sort of keep an eye on the agendas of those meetings, to respond to issues that are constitutional within the party, and to assist the party officers, that's the leader, the nominating officer, and the treasurer, in anything relating to electoral law. That's my job as the chairman. But regional coordinator then is a different thing. That's where the activism really happens, much closer to the grassroots. And my own philosophy of this is to take something from Stephen R. Covey, who you may have heard of, which is to try and be a servant leader. And that is to enable and empower, and that's a very overused word, but it is a real word in this sense. The local activists, local group leaders, and association chairs to be successful. Like with all libertarianism, it's voluntary. There can be no orders from the top. There can be no sense of dictatorial leadership. It is very much by mutual consent, and for me that's a great environment to work in. And I'm absolutely privileged in the Midlands to work alongside a group of really very adept, intelligent, committed local coordinators. I couldn't have a better team to work with to grow the party in the Midlands. It's great.
Fantastic, thank you. So last year you ran in local elections and for Parliament in North West Leicestershire. How did you find the experience, and do you have any fun stories from your time running?
Okay, well, it was my first time running for Parliament, and it had been quite a busy year because I'd actually stood in the local elections earlier the same year in May. And when you stand for a small party, the motivation for standing has to be a commitment to the values of the cause that you stand for, because it can't be based on anticipating big wins straight away. No one's, if a Libertarian Party candidate goes ahead and thinks I'm going to win this, in the next 5 years, someone needs to take them aside and say, look, there's still more work to do. One day you could win this election, but it won't be this time. So we're playing the long game to a great degree. And I approached both elections, the local one and the national election, with that in mind, playing the long game, because honestly, and this may surprise you and I because we understand what libertarianism is, most people on the doorstep ask, what's a libertarian? That is the first barrier that the Libertarian Party and the cause of liberty has to overcome in this country. So it is about understanding that's where you're at. And so you get very good at explaining very quickly what is a libertarian. And to be frank, a lot of people are very receptive to it. And if we can overcome the barrier of knowledge and just get the name out there and the values out there, I think we will do very well. So that's the position I took while campaigning, that I'm playing the long game. But it was great, but it was also a lot of hard work, and I got some great support from other members in the Midlands, some of whom travelled quite far to help me campaign, and that's really motivating. That's very important. And my family were there the whole time, and that's very important too. But in terms of funny stories, the one that really stands out to me, as part of the national election campaign, there was 2 hustings that I attended, and I'll be honest, I'm someone who's not unused to public speaking and getting in front of people. I used to be a college lecturer for several years. I've done lots of public speaking engagements of various kinds. But a hustings is a whole different ball game. That's a proper debate in front of people, in front of your very voters, who decide your fate. And there was 2. There was one in Holy Trinity in Ashby de la Zouch, and then there was another at the Community Hub in Castle Donington. And the first one was at Holy Trinity, and I really worked my socks off in that debate, and I was getting nothing from the audience. It was a tough audience, but the Green candidate of all people, there weren't standing ovations, but they might as well have been for the amount of enthusiasm that he was getting. I just couldn't understand it, and a party member had come to support me as well, and was in the audience, and they were like, what's going on, kind of thing. Anyway, later on in the week, we went to Castle Donington, to the community hub there, and had another hustings. It was totally different. My responses received, acceptable and pretty much equal applause, and people seemed to appreciate what I was saying, and that restored my faith, that I wasn't completely wasting my time. But it turned out that at Holy Trinity, the Green candidate had a connection with the members of the audience, which I wasn't aware of, and so I was unawares. I was the away team playing on home ground. And so I had a really tough audience, and I wasn't aware of it. It was great, though. It was great, good experience, and it's one that everyone will have to go through if they stand, but it's brilliant.
No, it is a lot of fun. I must admit, my own recollection of doing a hustings is they are terrifying, and I would recommend anyone that is a parliamentary candidate, get on with your opposite numbers, the other candidates, because it can be very lonely on a stage. And if you get on with them, it makes it a little bit easier. But you mentioned the long game there. The next election is likely to be 4 years from now. Where do you see the Libertarian Party being in terms of elected representatives at any level? And what sort of campaign do you think you might be running by then?
Okay, so let's start with the campaign we might be running, because that's really the level we're at the moment. So we've only, at a national level anyway, only ever stood a few candidates, and it's not been that much different for local elections. So I think it's important that we still put as many candidates forward as we can at each election. And so in my head, if I could set a goal, I would say I'd love to have 20 to 30 candidates standing at the next general election. And I don't expect a single one of them to win, but we have in the party, we have a little game where we try and beat the last high score of the greatest number of votes that a Libertarian's ever got in the UK. So instead of going all out, we go all out for a win, but we are fighting brand names. Let's face it, the Labour Party is over 100 years old, or is about 100 years old. The Tories are 200 or so years old, and we are literally the young whippersnappers, where you knock on a door and people say, what's a Libertarian? So that gives you an idea of the gap that we've got to cross. So I'd like to get 30 odd candidates to stand, and I'd like to have them get more than 1,000 votes each. That's what I'd like to see, because at that point, the press and the national attention starts to look at you. We weren't that far off having more votes across the nation than the SDP back in December. And so, in my head, I'd like to get more votes than some of those other more well-known smaller parties. And at that point, we start to gather some attention. But, all of this rides on us focusing our attention on local activism, because we have to answer that question well in advance of the election. What's a Libertarian? People have to know the answer before then. So, it's a regional party. It's up to regional coordinators to put their own plans into action. But my favourite approach would be to build local groups and associations, increase from there the campaigning on local issues, and increase the number of candidates standing in local elections. Those 3 things will attract new members and answer that question, what's a Libertarian, and make us recognisable in local communities ahead of elections.
No, absolutely. So one of the things you're doing to get noticed, of course, is you've started a recent video blog called The British Bunker. Tell us a bit about that. What's made you do it, and what's your feedback like?
Okay, so I started that back in April. A family member had actually, it was after the lockdown, after the self-isolation rules, before lockdown. And the family member had got a fever, the magic temperature of 37 point, whatever it was. And so I was on 14-day self-isolation. And frankly, I was getting cabin fever and going a bit stir crazy. So I started this video log on my personal Facebook timeline, just to family and friends as a way of expressing myself, talking about the situation and all of that. But a few of them said, why don't you make this public? So I did. I bought the domain name britishbunker.com. I set up the Facebook page and all this kind of thing, and it's become a place where I get to be Dan, and not Dan the chairman or Dan the regional coordinator or Dan the something else. This is where I get to be just me, talking about COVID, about politics, the world as I see it, away from all my other responsibilities. And feedback's pretty good. I mean, it's still very early days. I've probably not even been running it for a month yet, on the public side of things. But we'll see what happens. I enjoy it, so why not?
No, excellent. So, well, moving on to where we are now, you mentioned the pandemic there. I personally, I sort of sense a lack of common sense in society from the pandemic. Lots of people talking about, removing all risk. It's like people don't realise that life is terminal, and all these risks have an impact on the economy and our ability to earn a living. What do you think about that? And do you think we've got an education gap there, and how might we fill it?
Well, I mean, yes, we do have an education gap. The response we're seeing from people, it's the sum of all the messages and all the bombardment that people have had thrown at them for years. It's the sum of everything from public education, from the media, this idea that blind acceptance of whatever the official line is good. And it's always true, even though objectively we know it's not. We know that government hides things and lies to us and covers things up and seals documents for 40 years and all this kind of thing. We know that happens, and yet at the same time there's like this cognitive dissonance or something where we pretend that that's not happening right now. All the time, and so far too few are willing to question the official line of anything, and far too many judge a piece of information based only on its headline and which channel or newspaper it came from. So it reminds me of the meme that you may have seen going around Facebook that says, I hate thinking, me too. Let's just trust government to do the right thing. Yeah. And that's sort of, it seems to be the prevailing attitude, but the reality, you're talking about, people wanting to live without risk, but C.S. Lewis said something about this. He was asked, how does one live in the nuclear age? It was back in the 50s during the Cold War. Someone asked him this question, and his response was basically, well, in the same way one would live in any age, in the Viking age, you could have a gang of Vikings rock up and chop your village up, any time without warning. You just get on with life and you enjoy it and you do normal human things. And I think we've turned into a bunch of, I suppose, I don't know, sissies in a way, that we have become so paranoid. The extent, as we discussed earlier, of the immediate lockdown that was far deeper than government intended, just sort of shows how risk averse perhaps we've become. So, the reality is there is no everyone wins option. As you say, we're all born with a death sentence, and there will be COVID losers and there will be lockdown losers. And people, I think, believe that somehow there will only be COVID losers and none other, and therefore that's the only killer in the room. But anyone who thinks they're only saving lives and not hurting anyone in our current response is frankly deluded. I think people are doing their best, but their best is informed by a particular message that is being pushed forward. So I think we need to see more challenge, more questioning. I'm not saying disobedience, or anything like that, but I'm saying we should be making our voices heard. How many of us are contacting our MPs and demanding answers and all of those things? Because right now, under the legislation, we live under authoritarianism. And that requires us to push back and scrutinize our leaders.
Thank you. So you mentioned there we do live under a particular set of authoritarianism, particularly around COVID at the moment. But putting those rules aside, what do you think are the big threats to freedom in the UK, and what are the opportunities to expand it?
Oh my goodness. There are so many. I mean, I'm going to say straight away the Coronavirus Act 2020. Massive threats to freedom in there, and being able to be detained and checked out medically and all kinds of things. The contact tracing app itself, no one was more pleased than I when it didn't work when your phone was on standby. It's those things are threats to freedom. I wrote the other day on one of my channels, about Justice Brandis in a case in 1928 in the US about whether federal agents could wiretap your phone and whether that was a infringement of your civil liberties. And he, at the time, the court voted that it wasn't, and the feds could do that. But he had his voice was a dissenting vote, and he said, people, governments always do this, under the sort of label of being beneficent. But that's when you need to be most on your guard, because it's done by zealous people who think they're doing the right thing, but without really understanding what it means. And so there are so many sort of follow-on consequences from everything the state does. Every liberty taken has a consequence which can be expanded upon to take more liberty, and we have to understand that that's the case. I wonder how many people actually wake up in the morning and think, right now I live in an authoritarian regime. They can argue that they can argue that it's the only way to beat COVID-19, but what they can't do is deny that it's authoritarian, because it absolutely is. So I've mentioned the Coronavirus Act 2020. I've mentioned the Contact Tracing Act. And to go along with that, not so long ago, I think in the last 2 weeks, certain other government departments have been pushing to get access to databases of mobile phone and internet records, because they want to carry out their own investigations and they can't rely on the police doing it. That's terrible. That's absolutely terrible, because we're moving away then. We're moving towards technocrats doing their own investigations, away from the common law protections that, we ostensibly expect the police to follow. And, but there's a whole list. You could pick, any of them going right back to 1997. The Crime and Disorder Act 1998, aspects of that, the Terrorism Act 2000, aspects of that, Criminal Justice and Police Act 2001, aspects of that. Where do you end? Because this erosion of civil liberties has been going on for decades, and this is just one more.
No, absolutely. I'd hoped, and not perhaps realistically, that the government might furnish us back some freedom at the same time as they were taking it away for the lockdown. And you can understand why they put in the lockdown rules to some extent, but there's no evidence that this government's any interest at the moment in returning any freedom to us, or listing any rules. But we live in hope. Well, more than hope, what's the Libertarian Party going to do? So what's your chairman's pitch? Why should people join you, and how can they help you?
If people genuinely believe that we live in a free country and they want it to be one, really, they're the people we're after. People who genuinely believe that the power of government originates in the power of the individual first, then they're the people who need to vote for the Libertarian Party, because the reality is no other party thinks that way. For them, their power in government is just an extension of, the unwritten constitution with a monarch at the head, divine right to rule and all that kind of thing. So if you really believe that power should originate in the people and be accountable to the people, we're literally the only political party I'm aware of that would match that. We are the party of small government. And why? Because we believe that the best person to make decisions about your life is you. We want to be the relentless, peaceful revolution, that challenges the status quo. No other party will. It doesn't matter what they say. We've got, at the moment, in my opinion, the most left-wing, big state Tory government we have ever seen. There's no point in a Labour Party at the moment. No wonder Jeremy Corbyn was running far left, because, there's no reason to be in the middle. Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson might as well be standing on the same square. I expect them to, expect to see going forward. So the Libertarian Party is the one that understands the correct origins of power of the state, which is the people. We're the only ones that understand the importance of defending the smallest minority of all, which is you, the individual, by protecting individual rights. We're the only party who understands the economic dampening effect of big government and the liberating effect of a small one. So, if you want a party that really understands the role of liberty in a successful and prosperous life for individuals and nations, then the Libertarian Party is your only option. And for us to make the progress that we need to really impact politics in Westminster, we invite you to join the party and to become an activist, and perhaps, if it suits you one day, to stand as a candidate.
Fantastic, Dan. Thanks again for your time there, and great to talk to you.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful.
Well, thanks for that. Dan. What's the website of the Libertarian Party, and is that the best way for people to join the party?
It is. You want to simply put in libertarianparty.co.uk.